Hello, everyone. This is Tim Selden. This is the weekly Montessori Leadership webcast from the Montessori Foundation and the Montessori Leadership Institute. This is a series of free webcasts that are offered to anyone who's interested in Montessori, whether you're a Montessori school leader or a teacher or a parent, or just someone who wants to learn more about Montessori. Please feel free to share with your friends. The live broadcasts are open to up to 10,000 of you. This is July 5th, 2017, and yesterday was July 4th, or the 4th of July, which is the day America declared its independence. And so, as a result, Dr. Michael Dorer suggested that a great topic for this particular week would be one that's of interest to all of us, regardless of the age of the children we teach, or whether we're a parent, or whether we're a school leader, and that's independence from the Montessori perspective. With me are Dr. Michael Dorer, Jonathan Wolf, and Kathy Leach. All three of them and myself are senior consultants with the Montessori Foundation. All of us are Montessori teacher educators. All of us have been involved with national leadership in Montessori education, led schools or lead schools today, and are involved with helping schools grow strong. We'll talk more about that when it's time for a sort of mid-broadcast break. Michael, let me hand it off to you and to Kathy, who's going to facilitate. Hi, Kathy.
All right.
Hi, welcome everybody. Yeah, nice to see you. I'd like to check and see if people actually see the handout that Michael has provided on the right side on the GoToWebinar control panel, partially because I can't see it, but Tim has uploaded a handout. So I just want to see if any of you can actually see the handout. And if you could go ahead and write into your question screen, just like you did, to let us know that you could hear us.
It just appeared for me, and if you're looking, it's called Independence Webinar 2 .pdf.
Oh, so yours showed up now. Okay.
Mine just showed up.
That's terrific.
Okay.
We'll see if anyone else is did, and otherwise, go ahead.
One of our attendees is saying that she can see the screen, but she's not seeing us. And I'll tell you the secret to that. All of you are probably logged into a program called GoToMeeting. If you are, there should be at the top of your screen a menu that starts with GoToMeeting and says various things. Go under Window and choose Bring All to Front, and that should bring all of the different images, the webcams, as well as Michael's screen sharing right to the front.
Okay, that should help, and we're getting a lot of feedback that people can indeed see the handout and can access that. So terrific, and Tim, thanks for those directions. So with that, Michael, we'll go ahead back to you and get started.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Michael Dorer, and happy Independence Day to those of you who are in the United States. As Tim said, the 4th of July is a national holiday here in the States. Last week, Kathy said something like, I wonder if they have the 4th of July anywhere else. And I said, yes, they all have the 4th of July, but we also have Independence Day on that day. And that's what we were celebrating. And that led to us thinking, well, what a good topic to talk about. It's a central topic in Montessori. It's a core topic, the idea of independence. And we hear it bandied about a lot, both in the pluses and minuses. And sometimes it's the topic of criticism for Montessori, sometimes a topic of praise. So I thought this would be a time when we can do an overview, an exploratory look at independence. So let's start off with the idea, and let me just click on this once. Let's start off with the idea of what it is. What does it really mean? Well, the etymology of independence really means not dependent. It simply is dependence with the in stuck in front of it to mean not. So it's really not dependent. I think that's really important for us to remember. When we think about children and what it is we want and what it is we hope that they want, whether they know it or not, and what society, what all of us really want. If we look at the notion of creating dependent people, I think we can agree that's not what we want. So looking at that opposite really helps us to realize what it is we're really after. See, dependent really means relying on others completely, being under the power of another. Its original meaning actually goes down to meaning hanging down, like a pendant hangs down from your neck, or if you were wearing something. And it's hanging down from something superior, a superior force, a superior support. It means, in the case of a child, that superior, well, guess what? It's an adult. So a dependent child is any child is in a power differential with adults. We have more power. We're bigger than they are. We tend to know more, originally at least. Maybe by the time we're adolescents, that's up for challenge. But there is a power differential. And so dependence is actually easy to create. Independence is where the challenge lies. Independence means thinking and acting on your own. It means freedom from control of others. It means creative and innovative thought. I like this word from Old English. They called it selfdom. That's an archaic word now, but I kind of like it. It's selfdom, meaning the state of being yourself, of having yourself. It's kind of a nice word, even though it's definitely an out-of-date word. We need to think there are different kinds of independence. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. One is intellectual independence, an independence of thought. And that's really important to us. Creative independence, the ability to create, develop, think about, which where it interfaces with thought, but actually produce things that are your own, that aren't necessarily according to somebody else's pattern. There's financial independence, and we'll talk about that later on, especially when we get to the adolescent. There's emotional independence. That is the ability to have one's emotions somewhat under one's own control without always being subject to the vagaries of others. There are other kinds of independence, but it's not a word that just means one single thing. Nevertheless, that one word describes something we're after in Montessori. Why? Well, it's really pretty important. And these are 5 big reasons why independence is important. All of these reasons have been supported by research, but not necessarily in a Montessori classroom. But the first one is independence boosts confidence. Children, adults, people who think independently, who have the ability to create independently, to own their own being and their own thought, to have this selfdom, tend to be more self-confident. They are confident in their own abilities because they exercise their own abilities. When you are dependent, you are in fact not confident in your own abilities because you're handing them off to someone else, whether on purpose or not. And that leads to the second one, less reliance on others, more self-reliance. So again, looking at the opposite, self-reliance is a positive quality that we would want to engender within Montessori. What's the other thing that we're trying not to engender is reliance on other people. Reliance for what? For emotional support. Reliance for their thinking and their thought. Reliance upon them for their creativity. Independence trumps all of those things. And then the third thing has to do with emotional independence, which I spoke about a little bit earlier. It reduces stress and produces happiness. It produces happiness because we're not seeking to have all of our state of being depend on somebody else. That we don't have to depend on, my own security and happiness depends on what Tim Selden thinks of me. That is a lack of emotional independence. So of course, I hope Tim does approve of what I'm saying, but my self-confidence and self-worth ought not to be entirely dependent upon that. And that leads to the fourth value, that independence promotes self-esteem. Self-value. It's now fashionable to say things like, learn how to love yourself, learn how to care for yourself. And this is one thing that we can do with independence. And finally, this emphasis that I think has been my emphasis for a long time, and that's intellectual independence. The idea of helping to create free thought, unique thought, creativity, which I believe is at the core of a lot of what we do with Montessori, is this idea of independent thought. It does not mean that we are entirely separate from other people, but we have the ability to think for ourselves, and we value that, or I believe Montessorians value that in children and in the developmental process as they go from infants to adolescence and on to college and university. But some people say, but what about interdependence? Isn't that really the virtue we ought to be after? Isn't that something better? Well, I like this quote from Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw said, independence, that's middle-class blasphemy. We're all dependent upon one another, every soul of us on earth. And you know what? He's right. That's the thing is, Shaw often did say uncomfortable things, but he's right in this one. And he's right from the Montessori concept too, because in Montessori there are certain underlying so-called cosmic principles or precepts, certain underlying notions. And one of those is connectedness, that all things are connected in some way, that we are in fact interdependent, sometimes visibly and sometimes invisibly. So we might not know the connections, which doesn't mean they're not there, it just means we don't perceive them. But here's the catch. To Montessorians, independence can coexist with interdependence. In other words, independence is a precursor to understanding really the state of being interdependent. The ability to think individually, the ability to have control of one's own emotions to some extent, the ability to act independently within whatever responsibilities or limits there are, leads to being able to work collaboratively and cooperatively with others and appreciate independence. However, interdependence does not coexist with a dependent state. So unless we help children not to be dependent, we're not going to help them to achieve interdependence. Interdependence comes as an outcome of independence. So yeah, we really do think interdependence is important, but our focus today is going to be on independence. Now, some people think it's a bad thing.
Michael, let me interrupt for just a minute. I think that the differentiation you made between independence and interdependence, and the fact that we have to have some independence in order to be counted on to be in an interdependent relationship, is a really important point. And so often I hear from teachers, well, I want the children to be interdependent. I think that's a really important point. At the same time that you've rightly so defined for us that it's not just about being dependent, that it's really, you have to have a certain level of independence first. So I appreciate that point. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can go ahead and ask questions or put comments, and periodically we'll be able to read those for you and get some response from Michael and the rest of the panel. So thanks, Michael. Yeah. Go right ahead.
Yeah, Kathy's really good at stopping me with certain things like that. So if you've got a question, take her at her word. She means it. Go ahead and ask the question because we will try to deal with it. And I generally say, as she just did, let me finish a slide, let me finish a comment, and then we'll, if there's a question, we'll deal with it then. But we're not going to ignore you. We want to pay attention to your concerns, your questions, your thoughts. But I'm glad you like that idea about interdependence, Kathy, because
it's a really important point.
It is, and it's not an either or. That's what we need to understand. It's not either you're independent or you're interdependent. Independence is necessary but not sufficient for interdependence. So it's necessary. Now you need a little bit more. You need some collaborative skills. You need some some more to get to the interdependent state, but you can't get there unless you first get to some level of independent thought and action. That's what I think is the core of what it is. This is why Montessori has this dichotomy of emphasizing both things, emphasizing independence, but also emphasizing the connectedness of all things. So it really isn't a dichotomy, is the interesting thing. It's actually a unity. It just seems different to us at first. But we do need to realize we're not going to get there unless we get past the notion of a dependent state. Okay, so let's go on to this next slide. Because I was just saying some people have arguments about independence, and you hear these from outside the Montessori world a lot. Like our emphasis on individual work with the primary, that is, in America means the 3 to 6 year old children or below, our emphasis on individual work leads to selfishness or egocentrism, that it doesn't actually lead to positive levels of independence, that in fact it doesn't do that. And then some people challenge us on the basis that independent children have social development problems, that we in Montessori don't do enough to socialize children. Well, you know what? Those are not actually backed by the reality of what happens in a Montessori classroom. What actually happens in a good Montessori classroom is that sharing and caring for one another grows out of self-respect, does not grow out of being compelled to share with another. It doesn't grow out of a compulsion where they're being forced to, okay, you've had enough time with that cylinder block, now you need to turn it over to Sherry, it's her turn. That actually does not lead to independent thought nor to interdependent thought. So what we're really doing, these charges that you sometimes hear aren't really on target. In fact, we need to go back to the idea of the self-directed person, the independent person, and think the independent person makes those positive choices for sharing, for collaborating, for working with others on her own. On her own, not by being compelled by others. Okay? And another issue about independence is parental separation. If you've taught preschool or children's house, that is, we call it children's house, or toddlers or below, you may have parents who have a struggle with parental guilt, with the notion of independence is what it comes down to, with the idea that suddenly they're giving up their child and that this child is now going to go her own way, and it can be really hard. And that is an actual issue for many people that we need to think about positively approaching with parents, with families, because children can fall into a dependent pattern if we allow it to happen. And it's not that they wish to be dependent, but it's a habit. And they can fall into that pattern. So I've had parents, for instance, drop their children off in the first day or so of school, and then you look out the window and there's mom standing outside with her head pasted up against the window looking in. And if the children see that, their independence goes out the window right then, right to that same window, out to mom, and that can lead to tears and so on. So that's an issue with independence that we need to deal with. It doesn't stop there. My daughter, who's now in her 30s, but my daughter, when she was 18, graduated high school, and then hopped on a plane and went off to spend a year in Europe, to spend a year studying in Sweden. And we called her and we said, Margaret, we want to come and visit you. We want to come see how you're doing. And she said, you know what, Mom and Dad, this is my year. This is my year to be here. Why don't you let me have this year? I don't want you to come over here because I might get homesick or something. And then later, after this year is over, we can go back as a family and I'll translate or whatever. Well, that was hard for us to hear. And then I sat back and I looked kind of in a mirror, and I thought all her life we've been dealing with the issue of independence. We've praised it. We've thought about it. She's been in a Montessori school. Now I'm dealing with parental separation issues. And it was kind of a wake-up call to me. So it doesn't stop with the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old. It rears its head again if your child goes to a boarding school. It rears its head again when they go off to university. It rears its head again when you get into an empty nest. And all of this is about independence. That's what it really is about.
It's harder at different levels, though, don't you think, Michael?
Oh, yeah.
Challenges even the best of us, right?
Well, I'm not going to say I'm one of the best of us, but it certainly happened to me. And I'm here to say so. I'm here to say so. John, go ahead.
I was looking at those words on the prior slide, the selfishness and egocentrism. And, you know, it occurred to me, building on this idea that independence builds on interdependence, I'm wondering that children who've developed true independence, they also honor and respect other people's independence. It creates an honoring because they themselves have felt empowered, and now they want to help other people also be empowered, whether it's continue their work and honor their concentration. So I think out of that development of independence comes a regard for the need for others also to empower themselves and be independent.
I think you're right. I think when you talk about independent thought, for instance, you and I have worked together a lot. We don't always agree on everything, but I respect your independent thought, and I hope you respect mine. As you are independent, you begin to respect other independent and creative thinkers, even though they may not be congruent with every single thing you believe in. So conformity, and we're going to talk about that in the very next slide, conformity isn't a requirement for independence. You can respect the differences, the diversity in people, and be independent at the same time. So I think that's a really good issue, John.
Thank you.
And Tim has something to add as well.
Yeah, I think that Michael and John have covered this nicely, but I think it helps to remember something else. Many times we as Montessori educators are addressed on this issue, and you know, there's the whole concept that traditional education and direct instruction is much more efficient, tends to produce at least the impression that they're covering a lot more content, learning a lot more skills in less time than Montessori, and that the kids are much more focused on test scores, and the schools are bragging about test scores. What we've got to remember is the idea that what we're doing with these kids is putting them into a partnership culture. And we're teaching them an art of getting along with other people, respecting themselves, feeling independent, taking personal responsibility, hopefully developing what is sometimes called grit or executive function skills. And that what the research shows is that these skills, the very things that we're doing, are generally not as well developed in the more traditional program, not because they can't be. Some kids do very, very well in almost any program, but because the programs are designed to tear one down and teach compliance, which I know is your next topic, Michael. But this idea of shame and conformity and learning to give the right answer and look to the other person for approval is a way of, shall we say, challenging a sense of personal responsibility and power. And the way it works is the use of shame, or the hope of distinction. And what Montessori is doing is saying, we want to teach kids how to live and be comfortable in their own skins and define their own voice. And we don't choose to use the carrot and the stick overtly. I mean, there is always some carrot and stick, even if it's just our attention or a smile. But we're not overtly attempting to manipulate kids to get the results we want, and we're not focusing on results that are always as easily measurable as you may see in more traditional programs. But in the long haul, what the kids develop are psychological and other skills that tend to pay off in the long term at least as well, if not better, than the child who has been used to conformity and competition and working within the system the way the system wants them to work.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate that. You said a lot of important things, but there's one word that you said that I want to jump on, and that is a word that I have heard a lot. I just read recently a thing from a newly appointed superintendent of schools who is emphasizing that the goals in their schools, she said, should be clear, achievable, and measurable. The word I'm talking about is that last one, measurable. Because once we limit our goals to things that we can quantify and measure, we may eliminate some of the most important and significant societal goals, like caring for one another, like independence, as a matter of fact. That as soon as we say the only goals that are worth achieving are those we can measure, we lose out on some of the most important things. And so I'm glad you brought that up, Tim. I think that's really important that you said that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways I wanted to go ahead and say, one of the ways I like to look at, and this is a construct I developed a while ago about the developmental levels of children, is what I call a formative outline. So let's look at the formative level as we consider independence, starting with infants. Infants are in a period of absorption. When they enter the world, they have nothing to do but absorb everything that's around them. Their personality is not formed. In fact, Montessori said, one of the things she called this level, she said the body is formed, it's no longer embryonic, but their psyche, their inner personality and spirit is still embryonic. She called it a psychic embryo, kind of an interesting term. So they're in a stage that I call pre-formation. But then by the time they're about 18 months of age, they've achieved two great goals, typical goals, which are beginning to speak and transportation, self-movement on their own, walking. And now that absorption leads to a stage that we call formation. So the Children's House level and the primary level, the toddlers, that's we call the level of formation. Lower elementary is the level of information. It is the most information-rich level of Montessori. It is filled more intensely than any other level with vocabulary words in particular, and the basics for all other academic studies in the future. But when they get to upper elementary, they're in a stage of transformation. They take what they had in lower elementary, it has to be re-examined. If they've learned, for instance, as we typically do in the beginning with 6-year-olds, we talk about plants and animals as different kinds of living things, because those are things they can actually touch and feel and they see growing around them. But now in upper elementary, we start to explore multiple kingdoms. Maybe there's 5 or 6 or 12 or 18 or 24, depending on who's counting nowadays, or maybe they're saying there's no kingdoms, but greater domains. Our study has to be transformed and changed, and in doing so, the human being is transformed to a new level. And that transformation leads them out of childhood into adolescence, where they're in a stage of reformation. They are rebuilding now the psyche on a societal basis, but they're faced with a challenge. And this is what Tim alluded to, reformation versus confirmation. Are they going to conform? And there's a pressure for that among many teens to conform rather than reform their thinking. And of course, we're not interested in confirmation. We're interested in them reforming their thinking and bringing all of these other things together. So I think as we talk about independence, we see that there's a timeline of independence through birth all the way through that third plane. Montessori calls the teenagers the third plane of development, all the way through that third plane. And as a matter of fact, when we get into the expressive young adult in the 18 to 24 age, that's when independence really flowers and matures to its greatest extent. So it's a thread. It's not just a thing that you do just to your 3-year-olds or your 5-year-olds. It's a thread throughout all of their learning time. Now let's take a trip.
Michael, just a second here. We have a comment from Yvonne Froelich. She says, working in the second plane is very difficult if you've not worked on yourself in the first plane. And that goes to speak to what you just talked about, that is building on the previous level. So often we have concerns with children coming in at different levels in Montessori, and I'm personally an advocate that certain children and families with the right fit can come in at different levels. But at the same time, we have to be aware that if that preparation wasn't done, particularly we're talking about independence, the 7-8-year-old child that walks in that second plane of development may never have had the opportunity for independence before. And so we have some groundwork to do, some foundation to build that's always going to be different than if it was built during that particular phase that came before.
That's right. And when you say it's always going to be different, that doesn't mean we can't achieve a lot. And we can really remediate, and we can do it an incredible amount. But what you're speaking to is, again, something that Montessori called a sensitive period, that there are periods when if we don't do something about it then, we'll never quite get to exactly the same place. We can achieve a lot of things, though. And so, like Yvonne, I think it was Yvonne was the name, right?
Right, yes.
Like Yvonne, I've worked with elementary a long time, and I've worked with elementary teachers, elementary kids, teaching in the classroom, teacher training and whatnot. So I've been around the block with children that enter that 6 to 12 class, that's the second plane, that enter that class with no background of independent action or thought, that they're coming from a different construct. You're right. Now we're dealing with a challenge, and I would like Kathy, I think we can deal with it, but what we have to do is we can't make a presumption. We can't just assume if you just give them free choice, they'll become independent today. It doesn't work that way. And I'm going to talk about that when we get to the elementary. So let me defer some more discussion on that until we talk particularly about elementary, okay? I want to go to the supermarket with you. And actually, that's meant to be a little bit of a metaphoric joke. Nancy Rambusch was famous for having made a comparison, famous for a lot of things, but one of the things was making a comparison of the Montessori classroom to a supermarket. The owner of the supermarket, the management team at the supermarket, offers a free choice environment. They set up an environment with free choices on shelves for you to go about and make your choices. But they manage that environment so that hopefully you'll make the right choice. And the right choice, of course, to them is the one that's going to create the biggest profit margin for them. And actually, that's the right choice for us in the Montessori classroom, except we're looking for the intellectual profit, aren't we? We're looking for the personal profit, the independence that is the profit of doing something. And I think that that metaphor of the supermarket is helpful because, like them, we have shelves. And we have a lot of other things. So let's talk about some things in our environment that create independence. I'm not going to go through a whole environmental design thing, but there are 3 main elements of the environment that I think you need to look at to create independence. One is the shelves need to be uncluttered. Well, there's 3 main things with the shelves, I meant to say. The shelves have to be uncluttered with approximately a hand's width of space between each piece of material. The reason for that, and the next one is you have to have a spare look. Spare meaning not excess material. The reason is that empowers choice making. The more difficult it is to get material off the shelf, the more crowded it is, the harder it is to access the material, the harder it is for children to exercise independent choice. So look, we can tell kids, go pick something to work with, but if the shelf is crowded and cluttered, to execute that task is very difficult. But if it's a spare design, clean, with spaces around each piece of material for them to put their hands in and take the material out, then we are actually facilitating independence. And I think it's important to think that even in something as little as that, even in something as small as, oh, how my shelves are set up, yes, that has to do with independence. And then, just let me say this last one thing about materials at eye level, and then I'll listen to you, John. That the materials have to be in the classroom at the eye level of the children or below. Otherwise, if they're above the heads of the children, above their eyes, choice is diminished. They can't really make a choice if they don't see the material. They can't choose to work with it if it's out of sight. It's, you know the saying, out of sight, out of mind. So these are things that actually create choice. Choice, intentional choice, is one element of independence. Sorry, John, I wanted to just finish that.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, Michael. I'm wondering on the uncluttered and the spare whether there is also a kind of cultural neurological element here. My guess is that the children that Montessori worked with in the streets of Rome were somewhat intellectually understimulated, whereas many children, given their screen time, perhaps their diets, today children are very overstimulated, which I think argues that less is more in a Montessori environment. You will actually create greater independence and engagement if the environment is not cluttered with overstimulated children.
You're right. If you take a look at a book that came out that was kind of a blockbuster for Montessori a few years back by Angeline Lillard, that was the Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius. Most of you may have, if you haven't seen it, it's a good read. You should get it. But she talks about that idea of choice and the idea of either cluttered choice or too many choices from which to try to make a choice as actually impeding the process of choosing. And that there's evidence, there's research on that. So you're exactly right. When you clean it up and make an environment where there's less, the result is, yeah, there are fewer materials, but more, even though there's less, there's more in terms of choice making. So that's the interesting, it's another little conundrum, but it's an interesting thing that actually helps them be more successful in their choice making.
Sure, yeah. More clarity. And I know Tim had something to add there as well.
I think that it's always dangerous when we start talking about how children today are more stimulated than children were in Montessori's day. What we know is that the children that Montessori worked with in those early schools were generally from very chaotic homes, you know, families fighting, alcoholism, you know, these were really stressed families to a large degree. And you had a larger age range. When John and Michael and I began, Kathy, you're so much younger than us, it was common to find 7-year-olds in what we in America often call a primary or children's house class. That's why our diplomas read 2.5 to 7. So there was a wider age range. I think the key is this. Michael's conversation today is about independence. In 1908, a woman, an American author who took the Montessori course, one of the very first courses, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, in a book called A Montessori Mother, wrote that she felt that in America we were misunderstanding what Casa di Bambini means within the context of Dr. Montessori's world. In Italy, casa is family or home. And the best way to understand a children's house as it existed at that time was that those kids were there early in the morning until dinner time. They were cooking meals together. They were not just in a, quote, Montessori work cycle. They were learning how to do things for themselves. We can share pictures with you of kids serving soup and cooking and washing dishes and doing laundry and ironing with old-fashioned irons that were just miniature but had to be heated on the coal-burning stove. this whole issue of empowerment of the child and teaching them how to do it for themselves fits in with what John has raised, which is the issue of keeping the environment spare and trying to avoid stimulation. But I think it takes a lot more than that. It really takes the child feeling like he or she, or collectively they, are the masters and mistresses of the house, that they are really involved in not only decision making, but in the day-to-day working of the classroom, which is why so often I remind people that guides should not be wanting to go in that classroom before the children arrive and change things around. We all do it, but it's their house. They ought to see us if we're setting out new materials or making materials or rearranging the shelves. They shouldn't just walk in one morning and all of a sudden it's all been changed around. It's their house.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. I want to get back to a little more granular look at specific things within the environment. Two more things that there's a lot. I could do 2 or 3 or 10 of these webinars just on the environment, but I only want to focus on these things that have to do with independence. And then one more is floor space. We need to have floor space for several reasons. One is movement, one is work choice, one is because some materials, in order for children to feel free in using materials, demand space, like the number rods, the red rods, for instance, or a timeline. Those are things that you can't do on a table or desk or a small mat even. You need some open space. So to be successful in making choices, you should be sure to have plenty, there should be plenty of floor space in every classroom. In order to achieve that, typically I suggest you have seating spaces and table space for about 60% of the children. And the rest of the space in the classroom is cleared of those, so there's floor space for children to work. And that leads to seating and work choices. We need to be sure that that is an area of choice, that there are places for children to independently elect, within some sort of rules, to independently elect to work in different places. When I say some sort of rules, I mean things like we're not going to build the pink tower on top of a shelf, probably. That's in most classrooms wouldn't be assumed, but you need to have a place where you can do it. You need to have that floor space, but you also need to have seating space where you can do things like handwriting. And you need to have perhaps low tables that are portable, that you can move from place to place. All of these have a lot of reasons that they're good, but looking just at the reason under the heading of independence, it's because it empowers the ability to independently choose where and how to work. And that independent choice is an incredible contrast with conventional schools, where children in many of them don't have any of these kind of choices that are on this particular page.
Michael,
okay. Yes,
Michael,
sir.
Could you address a little bit the on the area of workspace, seating, and work choices, the balance in a Montessori classroom at different levels between individual workspace and collective workspace? I find that varies from class to class, which produces a different level of engagement and independence. Would you address that, please?
Let's take a look at some of these little quick pictures I wanted to flick through with different environments and get a kind of a concept of some of that. And I'll try to address it as I do that. How's that? Okay, so I have here, for example, an infant classroom. And if you look at what I was talking about, the eye-level material, the low-level material, look at the space, how spare the material is. There's a shelf with maybe 1 or 2 things on it, and the baby can crawl over to that. He can reach onto that shelf once he can get up and reach to it, and can see that. And if this is a child who can pull himself up onto his feet, that upper shelf is within reach. So for a child of this age, for an infant classroom, there really probably is almost no specified individual workspace like a table, because so many of them aren't at a table seating stage yet. Look at this little boy or this little girl, this little child who's crawling around and isn't at that stage yet. But when we get up to here is a toddler environment. And things are a little bit bigger, and over in the corner you see a table. Now at the toddler level and at the Children's House level, I'm going to suggest most of the tables should be set up for a single child. We should have a number of low, very light tables. Montessorians call them chokis. That's a Bengali word that just, it's a small table that can be carried around so they can self-group those if they wish to. But these larger tables, like the one that's in the corner of this particular picture, is for 1 or 2 children. And that's because we're developmentally, we're really interested in children developing their individual psyche. And that happens during this age. Until from now on through about their 6th year, until about the shedding of those baby teeth. This is where most of the psychic development of a human being takes place. Most of their psychological development. Remember the formation chart I gave you. It's not when the information enters their life so much. That's not really the goal at this level. It's the formation of the whole person, the psyche. And that means that it's kind of an individual task. Yeah, they're going to interact with others, and there probably should be a few group meeting spaces within the classroom, but that's not the focus. In a primary classroom, and I'm using primary in the sense of being a 3 to 6-year-old classroom, again, I like this picture because it shows materials spread out, not quite as much as I'd like, but they're spread out. They're not overly crowded, at least on the shelves, so that children get that choice. There is an abundance of floor space available. And, John, you see a single table in the background for a single child to be able to sit there. Again, that speaks to the issue of independence. There are other things about the environment that are well worth talking about, but I'm focused on independence today. And here's what I'll say one thing. You see the bead cabinet in the back? That's the thing on the right-hand wall that's slightly to the left of the windows. That's called a bead cabinet. That's an old style one that was made to be mounted on the wall. And in many classrooms, those are mounted 4 or 5 feet up on the side of the wall for no reason except that they chose to do it there. I like it that this one's at the eye level of children. It's down where it belongs. So they have the ability to make a choice. The elementary class, now all of a sudden look at those group tables. All of a sudden we've got kids working in groups. We still have plenty of floor space. We have some individual tables, but there's groups of children working together. So that's where the differentiation comes, John, is between that level of the Children's House, which we call the first plane, as you know, and this so-called second plane, which is the elementary school. And this grouping continues on through adolescence, that they can work collaboratively from then on. We don't revert to individual tables, but there's always a choice. There are a few individual tables here and there.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to take a look at those pictures briefly. Does that help speak to what you asked, John?
Yeah, very much. Thank you, Michael.
You're quite welcome. All right, so let's get even more granular. How do we create independence in the classroom? I'm hoping at this point we know once we've got an environment set up, and once you have the expectation that independence is a good thing, that you endorse it and believe in it, now what? Well, Montessori back in 1907 was known for giving children 3 freedoms. And those are the freedom of choice, the freedom to repeat, and the freedom of movement. Now, interestingly, all 3 of those freedoms have to do with independence. I've used the word choice quite a bit today, and that is misunderstood a lot. So let me speak about just 3 kinds of choices that I want to focus on that are really important. It's not that this is an exclusive list. I'm not trying to do that. But the ability to choose work partners has to do with independence. Work partners In other words, not having a fixed assigned seat. An assigned seat limits who you work with. It also limits where you work. So the freedom of choice of the place, that is where you work, and with whom you work, well, that's a choice in Montessori. And then there's the choice of when to work. Right now, I want to work on the number rods. I'll get to the work that I want to do with pouring later. Or maybe it would probably be more likely to be doing pouring now and get to the number rods later. But that scheduling is not up to the teacher. That scheduling is within the mind of the child. And if that time is extended and the child says, but I want to continue to work with it, well, you know what? That's the freedom to repeat. The ability that the child has to repeat the work frequently and go on and repeat the work and go on and repeat that work, like a thirsty person drinking until they are finally have their thirst quenched. Not saying, well, 3 sips are good enough for everybody, but enough to finally have that thirst of desire to work quenched with some particular thing. And then finally, with a relief, the child can put the work back on the shelf and someone else can have the choice. So choice and the freedom to repeat are both core. And finally, this freedom to move. Without movement, neither of those other two things, the choice or the repetition, can happen. The children have to have the ability to move to the shelf, to select materials or to access materials, to take those materials to a workspace, to work with it, and to return it. And that actually doesn't mean that they're running around the classroom, but they're moving their bodies. And there's also a freedom for small muscle movement. Now, every freedom bears with it a responsibility. So when we say movement, for instance, that doesn't mean we're running wildly throughout the classroom. We have the right, the responsibility to establish norms about these various freedoms, that there's a norm about movement, for instance, like walking might be the norm. But the norm cannot be do not ever move, stay in one spot, because that denies the basic freedom that the children need to have to be independent people. Toileting is a really good example. Do you ever want to go to the toilet? Do you ever want to go to the bathroom when it isn't a scheduled time? Of course you do. Not everybody says, well, at 10:30, that's bathroom time and we all have to get up and go. But I've been in Montessori schools where that happens. At 10:30, a bell is rung, all of the children come in line up, they're all taken out to the hall, they all go to the boys' or girls' bathroom, and then they all come back. And if it's your bad luck to not have to go to the toilet then, or to have had to go to the toilet earlier, you're out of luck. That does not foster independence. Now, we do have to have a management system about how kids go to the bathroom and to manage who's going there and how frequently and so on, but we can't block them from going to the bathroom because it stifles their independence. It totally stifles their independence. Snack is the last thing I want to talk about of these basics here. There are 2 foundational ways to give children a snack, individually or as a group. The group way is kind of like the group bathroom. Everybody, we ring the bell, everybody comes and sits down somewhere, and everybody has snack together. Or we have a snack set up somewhere on a shelf and a snack table, and children elect to have that snack when they want it, when they feel like it. And maybe they'll forget some days. Maybe they're not motivated to have the snack. Or maybe it's the first thing they do in the morning because they really are motivated. That is their individual choice. That leads to independence. So a group snack, except in certain exceptional cases, maybe a birthday celebration or something, group snack should not be our modus operandi. In the Montessori classroom, it doesn't lead to independence. We want the individual one.
So that kind of practice,
I already talked about oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Let me take this time and right in between that type of practice, particularly with young children, the toileting independently, having snack, even napping, which I know you're going to get into next. Those kinds of things are what help children develop that self-regulation, the executive functioning that we're talking about. And without that practice of when am I hungry and when am I tired and when do I need to use the toilet, we really don't develop past that, and children start second-guessing themselves. They start wondering, do I really know what's right for me, or does everyone else know better about what's right for me and whether or not I'm hungry? It sounds like a very simple thing, but it really interferes with the development of that self-regulation that also feeds to the independence as well.
Kathy, I think you've raised something that I'd just like to piggyback on very briefly, is that part of independence is self-awareness, whether it's at an older level, metacognition, knowing your own thoughts, knowing your own feelings, or just a basic sense of, I need to move from this to this, or I need to go to the bathroom. It's that awareness of need and awareness of self and awareness of others that builds that sense of independent functioning.
And then we wonder why people as adults don't have quote-unquote common sense to take care of themselves, because we've never practiced, you know, or didn't learn it, we didn't practice. Okay, Tim, did you have something to add there?
Well, okay. I think you're very right. I'm reminded of when I went to country school when I was a boy, to a little country, one-room country school. And when I went to town school, to junior high, we had a hall pass. And that's a little piece of paper, and it had 5 blanks on it, 5 blanks in a week. Those were the 5 times you could get a pass to go to the bathroom during the week. If you used those 5 times by Wednesday, it's too bad you couldn't go to the bathroom on Thursday or Friday. You had 5 passes, 5 check marks that had to be initialed by your teacher.
Talking about self-regulation.
Right. Well, and I'm talking about junior high. This isn't toddlers. This is people that are 13, 12, 13, 14 years of age. Well, I couldn't stand it. And I went to the teacher. I have to go to the bathroom, have to go to the bathroom, have to go to the bathroom. Couldn't get permission. I finally just had to go. So I went anyway. And as a result, got called up to the office to account for my bad behavior, and was labeled a behavior problem for the rest of the time I was there, because I had to go to the bathroom not according to schedule. So I'm sensitive to things like that for personal reasons, but I also see how it inhibits people across the board, as you said, Kathy. It's not just for me. And napping, here, look at these infants. Yes, we do have schedules in our lives, and we have to acknowledge that there are such things. We have certain times we get up, or that we go to work, that we eat lunch, that we go probably have relatively typical times we go to bed. But within those schedules, we need to have some flexibility. And with babies, if we have floor beds available for the babies, they can literally crawl over, once they're capable of creeping and crawling, crawl over to that bed and self-select their own nap time. And I've seen that happen. I was stunned the first time I was in an infant class and realized the prejudice that I contained within myself about what infants were capable of. And I had to revise that, because they are incredibly capable people. They do begin as incredibly dependent, of course. They're in utero. They depend entirely on their mothers. When we talk about prepared environment, that's the first prepared environment we speak about, is the uterine environment. But then they're born. And once they're born, they begin to move toward independence. But at first, when they're essentially immobile, they're very dependent on their families. There's 2 things that we need to be aware of to help them with independence. One is the role of movement, that babies need to have the ability to move about. And constricting their movement for our own convenience, like a playpen or something like that, isn't beneficial. It's about us. It's not about the child. Other times you may feel, but I need to have, while I'm doing something, I need to have this security that the baby is safe during that time. And I understand that. But as an everyday practice, generally, children need to move. They have to move. And that's because the very first human tendency identified by Montessori is exploration. So they want to explore. And how do they do that? Well, they move around. And then you need to also realize the importance of speech for independence, because with vocabulary comes the ability to put thought into words, to put words to thought. Vocabulary and cognition are united. They're tied together. And the more speech we give to children, the likelier they are to be able to develop independent thought. The fewer words they have, their thought processes become constricted. We don't want that, do we? Not for independence. So you need to be able to speak regularly and continually with babies on a regular basis and be visible. One of the things that concerns me a lot with babies is seeing them carried around in a car seat, which I call a bucket, but that's probably insulting, but seeing them carried around in a car seat or always pushed in a stroller, in either case where they may not actually have the ability to see a visible model, to see the parent making choices, to see the parent's lips moving when they're speaking, and so on. So being visible is part of what helps them to model on that so that they then can do those sorts of things too. If these things happen, whether they happen or not, no matter how they happen, the successful emergence from infancy means they've done a couple things. When they emerge from infancy, they typically are mobile and talking. And then we call them toddlers. So by 18 months, anywhere from 14 to 20 months, typically toddler classes begin and infant classes end, somewhere around that time. So let's take a look at them. Let's take a look at toddlers for a second. And I'm going to put them together with Children's House. Sorry, Kathy is a toddler specialist, and I lump them together because they're closer to each other than they are to infants. And here's where they're really close. The number one thing that you can do, well, one of the number one things that you can do for independence for children is practical life. Practical life has 4 goals: order, concentration, coordination, and independence, which I wrote in red so you'd see it's a big goal. The goal of this little girl pouring orange juice there is not, believe it or not, it's not to learn how to pour orange juice. That's a side effect of the actual goal, which is independence, when she can pour things and do things on her own. To look at the look on the kid's face about coordination and concentration, about order. So those are the things that are the overarching goals, and independence permeates all practical life. So when you do practical life, we're not just trying to teach children how to polish shoes so they can get a job at Downton Abbey someday and that they can go out and be a butler in some sort of a place like that and buff shoes. No, that's not the point. The point is, by developing their concentration, their sense of order and coordination, they also develop independence. Practical life is underrated in too many children's houses. The idea that, oh, we need to have that, we need to move them on. And I see teachers sometimes ask me, well, what can I do with children that are 4 and still want to do practical life? How can I get them onto the math work? How can I get them on to the language and reading work? But I'm going to say, if we aren't achieving the goals of a sense of order, inner concentration, coordination of movements, and independence, there's no point in going on. This is what we need to achieve. So,
well, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Michael. One of the things you said before about, this is the period of formation, not the period of information. And so I think that, keeping those things in mind, that we're just not here to pour information into particularly this age group, whether it be toddler or Children's House.
No, we're not. And then I'm glad you said that, because that's why I put that up in front, so that could somehow help us frame our discussion. Now, here's another thing. Now, once we've got the practical life thing going, you have to manage intervention in the Children's House. And this is a hard thing. People get into Montessori. People get into working with kids because they love kids. They like children. They enjoy children. And nothing's wrong with that. That's what we want. I love children, which is why I'm with children, and I bet all of you do too. And so we want to be with them. And then I'm going to tell you the hard thing. Stand back from them even though you love them. Even though you want to get engaged with them, we have to learn how to not intervene unless needed. The more we intervene, the more we encourage dependence. The less we intervene, the more we can allow independence. And I'll tell you right now, independence can't exist while the adult and the child are sitting at the same table consistently. You have to get up and let them and go away. You have to be able to do that. It's hard.
Michael,
and you can tell me about Mother Isabel and that just.
You read my Mother Isabel, who had been trained by Dr. Montessori, and I had the great privilege of being trained by her, once asked, what did Dr. Montessori tell Montessori teachers in the field who were actually in service more than anything else? She said, get away from the children, move away from them, give them the space. But isn't there a relationship? If the paradigm of toddler and primary or toddler and children's house teaching is, I've got to get this information across, you're going to be product oriented, which means you're going to be intervening to get them to do the right thing, to produce the right product, to learn the right information. So again, you have to look at, do you understand that this is a developmental period of the formation of personality, brain, body, emotions? It's not an information driving paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's so right. As soon as you decide, and let me just use a word that has more than 4 letters, but is sort of a swear word to me, and that's the word mastery. If we're going to insist that the goal is the outcome, the goal is the product, is mastery, instead of the goal being the procedure, the process, the involvement, then we're going to be focusing on the wrong things for what it is we're trying to attempt to actually achieve in a formative period. It's just not going to get us there. What we've got to see is that the actual pouring of the juice, the actual involvement in the task is the goal. That's actually what we want to see happening there. Now, as an outcome, it'll be great if she learns how to do it without spilling. It'll be fabulous if she learns how to eventually juice her own oranges and so on. But the way that we think about this child is from the lens of process. And that's what I think I heard you saying, and it's really important.
Thank you.
Well, I think too, the piece that John said about the adult moving away, I think that there's a physical, so not just you're not sitting at a table, but you're also not hovering. Your physical presence isn't, right over their shoulder, because then the child's feeling like you are still controlling and you are still judging and waiting for them to perhaps make a mistake. So to actually, be able to observe with the eyes in the back of your head, so to speak, to be able to move away so you're not psychically hanging over them as well, I think is important.
And I think, Kathy, there's an even perhaps subtler one that I see in some of the consulting work. How about getting out, after you've given a presentation or a representation, moving out of the child's line of sight? I've seen teachers move away, but stand in front of the child, so the child's going like this, looking for approval. If you literally have to get physically and visually and auditorily out of the way.
Absolutely.
That's right, and that deals with a couple of these bullet points that I had here, and I'm going to jump out of order because you brought this up, and so I'm going to jump down and say when to leave a lesson. That's one of the really important things, is when do you leave the moment that you're interacting with the child? You're sitting down with her and you're showing her how to pour. You're sitting down with another child and you're showing them the red rods. You're sitting down with somebody else and we're doing something like, let's say we're doing the number rods or whatever. We're doing the rough and smooth boards. Whatever you're doing, when do you leave? When do you get up and leave that lesson? Well, I'm going to give you a couple choices. One, let's complete the entire cycle of work and then get up and leave and put everything away. Well, in fact, you don't put it away. You could just get up and leave when the entire work cycle is over. If you choose that choice, the child will associate the completion of work with leaving and will begin to think, once I'm done, she got up and left, I can put it away. And that's going to impinge your repetition, the independent work. See, the independent work hasn't happened yet because you've been sitting at the table. You've been sitting on the rug. You've been there with the child. What you need to do is to say something like, well, this was interesting. Let's do it. Let's set it up again. Let's do this another time. Somehow suggest to the children that we're going to do it again. And when they're in the midst of the work, in the middle of the work, when the work's all spread out, then you leave. Because that leaves the work sitting in front of them. Well, I have to continue. It's out here. I'm going to do it. And that is one way to engender independent work. Work away from you. Work away from your physical presence. Now, Kathy and John, you brought up some other things too. And I have a system that I talk about a lot called Cora that has to do with a lot of things. But one thing it has to do with is keeping teachers off their feet for more than about 15 to 30 seconds at a time so they're not hovering. Because the hovering, I think it was you, Kathy, said that. You're right. That is so, and it's being in the line of sight, John. So the other bullet point that has to do with that is modesty of the eyes. That's a term I learned way back in training that meant don't catch the children's eyes. Don't look them in the eye when possible if you're observing, for instance, because it's an invitation for them to come over and get involved with you. You're inviting them. It can be interpreted that way and pull them away from their work. Now, if you're talking directly one-on-one to the children, of course you're going to look at them, depending on your culture. But when you're observing or you're looking at children and they're working with something, you don't want them to look up and catch you staring at them, catch you looking them right in the eye. And that, I like that term. It's called modesty of the eyes. And it was given to me by one of my trainers who happened to be a nun, and she said that's something they learned in the convent, but I still keep that language anyway, because I think it's important. And if you don't believe that, sit in a classroom with 3 to 6-year-old children and as an observer, and when you catch their eyes, it's very likely they'll come up right away and want to say, hi, how are you? Which means they're no longer dealing with their work.
Or it creates some instant emotional dependency. Children will look to adults for approval, and you don't want that emotional dependency being built either.
No, because one of the kinds of independence is emotional independence. So emotional dependency is 180 degrees from what it is that we want, isn't it? Now, a couple other things on this page that I think are really key. One is don't give away connections, even in the environment. Here's an example. You know and I know, if you know Montessori, you know that we have this material called the colored cylinders, or sometimes called the knobless cylinders. And we have another kind of material called the knobbed cylinders, or the cylinder blocks. And they have the same dimensions. In fact, they're interchangeable. I know that. Does that mean I should tell that to the children? Should I show that to them? If I show that to them, then I'm going to steal away their discovery. I'm going to take away the chance that they had to discover it on their own. How could I show it to the children? Well, I could put a little piece of colored tape on the knobbed cylinder that matches the knobless cylinder, and then they don't have anything to discover because I've given them the cue and taken away independent discovery. Now, a lot of independence does actually have to do with discovery. So if we're going to empower discovery, it means we can't tell them everything we know. Even though we already know it, we can't tell them everything.
I often talk to the teachers, particularly teachers in training or new teachers in their practicum year. It's not so important that we know what you know. We're trusting that you know those connections. It's really much more important for us to allow the children to discover those. And teachers, you know, I think in the beginning particularly, they just want to know everything. And so they're happy to share their own discoveries, but it really does impede the child discovering it.
That's so right. And so you'll see little cards that are in the environment, for instance, that show pictures or drawings of various pieces of sensorial material matched up against each other, like pink cube is built on top of brown stairs and so on because they have the same dimensions. Well, let kids find that out. You know, that once I say, hey, guess what, sweetheart, I already know something and I'd love to tell you, that child is no longer the scientist who makes the discovery. That child now is dependent upon you and your knowledge. You see what I'm saying? And so sometimes it's painful because we can watch the children and we think, gosh, you know, this is so, why don't you see this or that? Well, that's where patience enters in.
Michael, there's a term, many of you know it, that's floating around all of the technology sectors of business, which is called design thinking, which is just a fancy way of saying creative or innovative thought. And it's going to be very necessary, it is and will be very necessary for workers on all levels to be able to get out of the box of traditional thinking and see something in a different light. And so if we're handing children all the extensions and variations of materials, we're actually going against one of the very life skills that's going to be needed now and in the future.
And when should you learn that life skill? Should you wait until you're a graduate from college? Should you wait until you get that job in business? Should you wait until graduate school? Or is it possible that we could deal with it right now with children? And I know that's rhetorical, isn't it? But
absolutely.
And here's a couple other last things. Don't do for kids what they can do for themselves, even though sometimes it's painful to watch them struggle as they put their jacket on, or as they're trying to do this, or things that they can do. Here, let me help you with that. Let me do this. I can do this quicker than you. I can help you with it. It's a temptation that we have to restrain ourselves, because it's training them to be dependent. It's actually providing training for dependency. So that is a Montessori mantra, if there ever has been. And that goes with the notion that I said in a little bit before we did this, let me do it myself. It's letting them, really letting them do it themselves. We have to let them, because we could step in and take over with so many things.
Michael?
And yeah, I have one last thing on this slide.
No, go ahead and finish, please.
Well, the last thing is the toddler and child-safe environment. Now there's a lot of things that are in a child-safe environment that you think about, and people talk about toddler-proofing your house or something like that. But I'm not referring to all of that. I'm referring to the idea that it's safe to make the choice. What we put on the shelf should be available to work with. We shouldn't have something out there that's, you think, well, I hope nobody, this is breakable, I don't want anybody to touch this thing. This is something that is an antique that I don't want anybody to use, or anything of that nature. I saw one of the pictures I was looking at with the classroom, and this is a safety issue, had an electrical appliance of some sort sitting on the shelf, and the cord going down into the electrical outlet. If that's not safe for the children to manipulate, it shouldn't be there in the environment. If they're going to be independent, give them choices that they can make, that are okay to make, that this is everything here is a choice, not something that we have to say no. And here's the Montessori principle that underlies that. That is, the environment should be the one that sets the parameters and the rules and so on. So you're not going around constantly being the nag. That's how you're going to be seen, if you're constantly saying, no, 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 don't do it this way. You set up the environment so it controls that instead. And then within that environment, they can be independent. They can make those independent choices. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'm glad you completed that thought. What do you think about adding to this list the independence or the freedom to perceive the lesson in a different way? And we're not talking about extensions and variations, the creative extensions, but can a child construct the pink tower horizontally? I saw some 2-year-olds once take a very rudimentary mystery bag presentation or exercise in a toddler classroom, and one of the items on the tray of the mystery bag was a ball, and the ball was rolling around the tray, and they took everything off the tray, and started to roll the ball off the tray. They put the bag down, and so they were exploring gravity and the principle of the wheel. And I could see that the teacher almost stopped them from that discovery, but then she caught herself and allowed them the freedom, within respect, to create a science experiment. Do we have that freedom also in our classrooms?
Well, I think everything about freedom is qualified by within limits.
Yes.
By that term, within limits. So yes, I think they should have. What I don't think we should do is teach them how to do these things that they can find, that they might discover on their own, or they might not. That they might, I mean, there's a risk in that. No, one person may discover it and another may not, although those things tend to be catchy. Once someone gets catchy. But what you're talking about, John, look at that list of the real goals of practical life. Concentration and coordination are two things you were speaking about, really. When you talked about that balancing with the tray and the ball, that's about coordination, isn't it? And it's about concentration. Those are foundational goals. I'm glad the teacher didn't shut that down. I'm glad she didn't shut that down. Now, if the child had picked up the ball and thrown it across the classroom, that might be the limit right there.
Not so good. Now we're talking disruptive and all kinds of things.
But that I find, Michael, that fine line between a teacher observing and asking herself or himself, is this something that the child has perceived within the limits of respect and responsibility, or has this transitioned into chaos and purposeless work? It's a very fine line. And so the teacher has to be a very astute observer as well as in control of herself.
That's right. And whether you make the right decision or the wrong decision on that, ultimately, I'm okay with either one. What I do care about is that at least you think about it and that you consider it, because as you do that, you're going to make more correct decisions as time goes on. We're all going to make mistakes of things we do in the classroom, and somebody may shut down that activity by the kid and then later feel bad. That's okay. You'll have another opportunity. It'll come up again.
As long as
think about it.
As long as the teacher is being reflective and doesn't make it an unconscious habit of teaching.
That's right. The knee-jerk reaction has no place in the Montessori classroom. It just doesn't belong. So once you start finding yourself tending toward that, you need to move away from it. That's really important. Well, I see we're not going to get through everything in this session, but I do want to talk a little bit, because this has been really a lot from you guys too. I wanted to talk a little about the elementary class too, and I don't think we have time to go into the detail we did with the primary when we get to the elementary class.
Michael, I wonder if we want to, we just have a few minutes left and I don't see any additional questions here, but I wonder if we want to do part 2, because elementary, adolescence, and the independence of a school are the next topics, and they really, I think, hold a lot of interest for many of our participants, and I think that we could go into a lot more detail. I think it's great to kind of give a commercial about this element, what's coming next, and really look at, could we give it more of its due next Wednesday.
Right, I think so. And I want to talk a little about the elementary, the adolescent, and the teacher or guide, as well as the school.
Right.
Because independence is it's not just this detail that we hook onto the bottom with a footnote to the Montessori school. It flows throughout the whole darn thing. And of course, it is very, very significant in elementary school, and it's very significant with middle school and adolescents and high school, and even the adult, the teacher and the school itself. So I would like to do that.
I think that could work with our schedule, and I see that we're getting a few responses from our participants. Could you please do the elementary on another day? I think people are very, very interested, because sometimes it's easy for us to look at the younger children, sometimes, not always, and say, oh, I get that they're being independent, they might have spilled, or what are the risks? When we get into elementary and adolescence, I think a lot of people think the stakes are higher. And if you allow for some independence, will they do their work? Will they actually make good choices? And so, that's where I see a lot more of the controlling come in as well. So I'd really encourage us to consider that. we get a lot more detail next time, and this is so important to the pedagogy is one of the comments. So I second all of those and request that we.
Once you start looking at some of the things we said about Children's House, they're going to apply here too.
Absolutely, it builds on it, right? It's
new things.
Yeah.
Things like when do you leave the lesson, or what's the role of mastery. We'll revisit that a little bit because those don't go away. Those are still issues that are still going to be present. It's just that there are also some new issues.
Well, I think that what I've gotten from this is, and I hope everybody really has enjoyed this, I really believe that you've come at independence as a concept from a lot of different perspectives and really helped us, think deeply about the term rather than, letting children put their jackets on themselves. There's really so much more to this, and I think it does deserve another session. Tim, are you up for that? Does that work for you?
Yes, it does, and I really want to circle back to one of the comments I've emphasized today that I think we ought to flesh out more, and that is too often what's supposed to be a children's house is a teacher's classroom. And too often people are complaining that children aren't becoming independent and normalized the way they think they should be. There is a direct link between what we're talking about and the granular practical things that facilitate the children's sense of empowerment and ownership and the role of the adult that's appropriate and called for by Montessori if you want to get the results that Montessori saw around the world, and we continue to see in those schools that follow those steps to this day. So sure, let's do that.
Let's do that. We've got some great comments here, and thanks, and this has been very helpful. This is from Amy, and helpful to think about parent education too, and I couldn't agree more. This is something that as we have parents as our partners, of course we want to share some of those ideas and thoughts as well.
Absolutely. I had promised I was going to do a mid-seminar messaging. Let me do a wrap-up. First off, I want to thank you folks for what you've contributed this conversation. I very deliberately tried to keep more silent this time because I think we all have so much to share. And Michael, you really organized today's presentation. Did a beautiful job.
Thank you.
There are a few things we just want to make sure those of you who are listening know about. The first is today is the 5th of July. And some of you are school leaders or are working closely with school leaders, and you're already starting to look ahead to what are your school's needs for the teachers coming back, for staff orientation, development, professional development, and in-service over the year. I want to remind you that all 4 of us, plus many other Montessori Foundation senior leaders like Paul Epstein and Tanya Riskin, just to name 2 more, are available to work with you and your school in lots of different ways. We do one-on-one consultation. Jonathan and I are developing a new program that's an ongoing school mentorship program. Michael Dorer and I are working on developing a program that'll be for teachers that want to really increase their knowledge, become master teachers. And there's so many other opportunities. All of us will be happy to either come to your school to do a day, a weekend, a week of on-site consultation, professional development. John and I and Michael, we often do things by long distance, just as we're speaking to you today. We'll do very focused and professionally presented workshops customized for your school. And then we come out to schools. Michael would love to do his storytelling workshop for you, or his You Can Teach It All. Jonathan Wolf has a list of hundreds of different workshops you've done, not hundreds, maybe 100. The bottom line is we're all here to help. Reach out to any of us. Our names, the way it works, the Montessori Foundation, of the person who looks the youngest and has the blonde hair is not Tim Selden, that's me. That's Kathy Leach. Kathy Leach at Montessori.org, Michael Dorer at Montessori.org, Jonathan Wolf. By the way, there's no period or space or hyphen. Or just write me, and you all hear from me 2 or 3 times a week, so probably you know how to reach me. Let us know if we can help, because that's what we're here for. And lastly, we're looking for volunteers who want to take a preview look at a new parenting education program for parents that Lorna McGrath and the Montessori Family Alliance have developed for members of the Montessori Family Alliance and the schools that provide the alliance to their schools. If you're interested in learning more about that, either contact me or contact Lorna McGrath at Montessori.org. And again, remember that Lorna does a weekly webcast every Tuesday at 1 o'clock aimed at parents. So that's what I was going to share at the middle of this session, a little bit hurried, but hopefully it made sense, and we're happy to help. Just write to us or call us, and we'll be happy to talk to you about the needs for your individual school. So I think that's it. Any last words from any of you folks?
No, well, yes, I want to say thank you for telling me to go ahead with this. I am really delighted to have had the opportunity to discuss this, and I'm glad that we're going to take the time to look at the upper years, the 2nd and 3rd plane, and beyond next time. So it'll give us an opportunity to go forward. Thank you all for being with us.
Wonderful presentation, Michael.
Send me a little paragraph describing the 2nd session from your perspective.
Okay, I'll indicate that it's a continuation, and let's remind everybody that these are recorded, and they're going to be able to, if they didn't see the first session, they'll be able to see it, so they won't come into the second half of the movie without seeing the beginning.
I have a request that just came in from Yvonne. How do you spell Lorna McGrath's email? Kathy?
Yeah, that would be Lorna, L-O-R-N-A, and McGrath, all one word, M-C-G-R-A-T-H at Montessori.org.
And the program is called the Parenting Puzzle. And that is the name of the first course in what will become a series of courses. This one is sort of a generic how to parent the Montessori way that every parent, regardless of their child's age, would do well to take. And it can be used by a school, it can be used by an individual family. More typically, we expect schools will have their families sign up, and then they'll hold optional live sessions for discussion at the school in addition to the way the course is structured. And we'll be talking more about that, but we're ready for sort of pilot previewing for a group of people that would like to volunteer their time to give us comments and suggestions, and there'll be lots more. And finally, if you don't get Tomorrow's Child for your families, there's still time. Midsummer issue will be coming out very soon. The back to school issue mails out typically in very early September. And joining the Montessori Family Alliance, which includes Tomorrow's Child magazine, is a rich experience. And some of you are already beginning to discover that if you go to Montessori.org and you try to sign up, it takes you to a new website called MontessoriFamilyAlliance.org, and that will, in about a week, become Montessori.org. So don't be surprised. I've been sending out emails all day to confuse members who are saying, what's happening? Montessori.org still exists, but you can't renew your membership there anymore. It takes you to the new website. So we're in the transition period. I think that's it for us for right at this moment. Michael, thank you. Jonathan and Kathy, thank you as always for making your time available as well. We'll see you all next week.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
See you in a week.
Thanks.
All right.